County. And in just a few minutes, we are going to be hearing from Paula May, and she is the agent in Van Buren County. So today we are going to be talking about pickling fruits and vegetables. So we're going to be talking about pickling, but we're going to focus on quick pickles. We'll do that towards the end because at the beginning we want to give you kind of all of that background knowledge. So we're going to talk about the basics of preparing and processing pickled products, the difference between pickled and fermented, and then also the different types of pickled products too. And then we will also talk about the importance of various ingredients in pickled products because a lot of times with food preservation and canning, the ingredients aren't just about taste, they also serve a purpose for the safety of the product as well. So if you've joined us for previous sessions of Extension Explorers, this should look really familiar, but I think it's really important for us to mention it each time. So we want to make sure that we can food safely. And so we want to do that so they don't spoil and also so they don't make us sick. So the microorganisms that we really are concerned about with home food, preserved foods is mold, yeast, and bacteria. And the way that these get into our products is from the soil and water. So it's easy to see how they can get into those canned products. So mold, yeast, and bacteria are our main concerns, but specifically with the bacteria, Clostridium botulinum is a bacteria that we're mainly concerned about with canning because they can't be seen or tasted, and also because they grow in the environment that we create when we can. So they like to grow in a vacuum, which is what we do when we can foods. They like to grow in foods with less acidity, so acid is really important. And then they also grow in room temperature foods. So we know that after we've processed and we've canned our things, then we store them at room temperature. So that's the reason why Clostridium botulinum is especially of concern. So with that, I mentioned acidity. So that's something that with canning, we are always really focused on. So high acid and acidified foods can safely be canned in a water bath canner. So those are things like jams, jellies, fruits. Those are naturally really high in acid. Pickled foods need to have an acid added to them. So we usually use vinegar for that. And that's so they can become more acidic so that we can use that water bath canner safely with them. And also, I mentioned the Clostridium botulinum and the acid. We have to make sure that we have enough acid to inhibit the growth of Clostridium botulinum. So we talked about in previous sessions that a pH of 4.6 or below is really kind of our key marker for that. So an exception to this is figs and tomatoes. So they may not be super acidic. We may think that they are, but they're really kind of on that line. And so we have to also add acid to those to make sure. And if you were here for our session last month, we talked a lot about acidifying tomatoes. And if you weren't, then hopefully you can catch the recording on that. Paula's going to show us at the end where all of those recordings are and where you can find more information about canning on a great resource website that we have. So we always want to process our pickles and our other acidified foods in a boiling water canner or a water bath canner. And this is to kill those microorganisms that can cause spoilage. And also because we know at that temperature that most of those microorganisms and bacteria can be destroyed. And I also want to mention that we always want to follow a tested recipe. And what that means is it's been tested for safety. So we know that we can replicate that recipe over and over and over again, and it's going to be safe every time that we do it. And when you're following that tested recipe, make sure you check those process times. And also check the size of the jar as well. We want to process according to the size of the jar. So always follow those tested recipes. That's really important for food preservation. Also important is we want to make sure that we follow the ingredients that are on those recipes. So it can be really tempting, especially with pickles, because I feel like those, when we see them, they can look really pretty in the jar. And so maybe we see pictures that look really nice and we want to try out those recipes. But just be really careful when you're using recipes. We want to make sure that they're tested, they're from a good source, and they're not just something that we saw, on someone's blog or somewhere on the internet. And that's because the level of acidity in those pickles is just as important as the taste and the texture of them. So just a few notes to remember, do not alter the vinegar, food, or water proportions in the recipe. Again, that's because of the acidity. You have to make sure it's safe. Use only recipes with tested proportions of ingredients. And there must be a minimum uniform level of acid throughout the mixed product to prevent the growth of Clostridium botulinum. So there's a variety of different pickled foods that are classified by their ingredients and method of preparation. There's many safe processes available to make different types of pickled cucumbers and other vegetables like green beans, fruits, and relishes. So let's talk a little bit about the different types of pickled products that there are. So if you've ever looked at pickled recipes, they can be kind of confusing because sometimes there's different ones. Some of them take quite a bit of time. Some may be a shorter process. So let's talk about the difference between them. So let's look at pickled versus fermented. So in pickling, you typically use an acid like vinegar to make fruits and vegetables more acidic. Now with fermentation, you let the bacteria that produce acid grow to make the fruit or vegetable more acidic. And this is usually done with salt. So salt not only draws out the water out of the produce, but it can also prevent the bacteria that you do not want from growing. So regular dill pickles and sauerkraut are fermented and cured for about 3 weeks. Refrigerated dills are fermented for about a week. And so during that time, they go through a process of curing, and then also colors and flavors change and their acidity increases. And this is due to that bacteria, it's producing lactic acid and increasing the acidity of it, which we want. Some products are brined in salt and water and are cured to produce the color and flavor changes, but they may not be fermented. In this case, vinegar is added later to preserve the food. Now, there's also these fresh pack or quick pickles or quick process pickles, and these are not fermented. So the produce is covered with vinegar and with seasonings, and it's processed in a boiling water canner. So even though these aren't fermented, you may see some recipes where they're still brined in a solution of water and salt, and then they may sit overnight or sit for a few hours, and then they're drained and covered with vinegar and seasonings. So there's a lot of variety in recipes, and that's why it's so important just to make sure you're always using a tested one to make sure that they are safe. So just to review about increasing the acid. So we know that we have to process a food in a boiling water canner to make sure that they're acidic enough to prevent that growth of Clostridium botulinum. So there's 2 different ways with pickles and fermented foods that we can do that we can increase the pH to make sure they're safe. So one is the fermentation process, and that's creating conditions where lactic acid is produced by bacteria, and you use that brine, that salt and water solution. And then the second one is adding acid, vinegar, to the food, and that's called pickling. So a food can also be brined during this, and that's to produce that flavor and color. But if it's not fermented, then it does have to have that acid, which is typically vinegar, added to be safe. So when we think of pickled foods, a lot of times we think about pickles or maybe even some relishes, but there's really different types of foods that can be pickled. So one of them is fruit pickles, and they're usually prepared by heating the fruit in a seasoned syrup And this is usually acidified with lemon juice or maybe with vinegar. So some fruit pickles that have tested recipes are cantaloupe, fig, crab apples, pear, and watermelon rind are just a few. And I was just curious, I've never made any type of fruit pickles before. So I was curious if anyone has made any of those. So if you have, I would love for you to leave a comment in the chat, or you can speak up later once we stop the recording. I would love to know if you have made any of these fruit pickles before, or maybe if you've even just tasted them before. And then also there's relishes, which are maybe a little bit more common. So these are chopped fruits or vegetables that are cooked with seasonings, and they have vinegar in them as well. So long as we think about pickle relish, but there's also, if you're interested, tested recipes for pear, a pepper and onion relish, corn, squash, tomatillas. If you were here last month, Whitney Danhoff from Bedford County talked about some tomatilla sauces. There's also relishes for green tomatoes and apples. So we've talked a little bit kind of about the background behind it, but let's go into kind of the process for making those pickles. So the first thing we're going to talk about is equipment and utensils. So pickling liquids should be heated in stainless steel, aluminum, glass, or unchipped enamelware saucepan. For pickling liquids, we want to make sure that we don't use copper, brass, or galvanized or iron utensils. And that's because those metals can react with the acid or with the salt that you're adding to those pickles. And so it can cause undesirable color changes in the pickles. So we want to make sure that we stick to just using the safe metals and avoid copper, brass, and those galvanized or iron utensils in there. And then also keep in mind, if you are doing the short-term brine or if you're soaking, then we need to use crocks, saucepans or bowls that are made from stoneware, glass, stainless steel, aluminum, or unchipped enamelware. And keep in mind that unchipped is a big deal because if it is chipped, then that's a chance for bacteria to get in there. So we want to make sure that everything we use is unchipped. You can also use these same containers when you're soaking cucumbers and lime, which Paula will talk about in just a few minutes, except for aluminum. You can't use the lime with the aluminum because the lime will cause the aluminum to pit. And so when this happens, the container can kind of get indentions or depressions in it. So we want to try to avoid that. So now we're going to switch over a little bit, and Paula's going to talk to us about ingredients and how to actually do this. So she's going to give us some step-by-step instructions.
All right. Excuse me. Now let's take a few minutes to talk about the ingredients that go into pickling. The basic ingredients in pickling are the produce, salt, sugar, vinegar, herbs and spices, and water. Now we're going to look at the cucumbers that go into pickling, and we're asking for name that cucumber. Many kinds of fruits and vegetables can be picked. Let's talk about these cucumbers. Some cucumbers are better than others for pickling. The first one is the slicing cucumber, which are the regular cucumbers that are grown to eat fresh. They're often waxed and become yellow and more bitter when they are overly ripe. Cucumbers with wax, they're not good for pickling because the pickling solution has more difficulty getting through the cucumber. They also can have large seeds and seed cavities, which is not good for pickling. Pickling cucumbers, which is the one in the center, tend to be shorter, thicker, lighter in color, and come in different sizes. They have smaller seeds and seed cavities than the slicing type. They have bumpy skin with tiny white or black dotted spines. And very importantly, they are not waxed. The English cucumber, which is that third one, it's also called a burpless and other various names, have a sweeter, thinner skin than other cucumbers. They are easily digested, and they are nearly seedless and have a delicate skin and are often shrink wrapped in plastic. Now we're moving on, looking at the pickling cucumber specifically. The pickling cucumbers are, of course, recommended for pickling. Whenever you are planning to do this, you want to select firm cucumbers of the appropriate size, about 1.5 inches for gherkins and 4 inches for dill. Use odd-shaped and more mature cucumbers for relishes and bread and butter style pickles. Try to pickle fruits and vegetables within 24 hours after they are picked. Vegetables should be tender. Fruits should be firm. Peaches and pears can be slightly underripe for pickling. Produce should not have any mold, not even a small amount. Processing will destroy mold, but will not destroy the off flavor it produced as it grew on the produce. Now we're going to look at the salt. Use canning or pickling salt. Fermented and non-fermented pickles may be safely made either using iodized or non-iodized table salt. However, non-caking materials added to table salts may make the brine cloudy. Flake salt varies in density and is not recommended for use. The salt used in making fermented sauerkraut and brined pickles not only provides flavor, but also is vital for safety and texture. In fermented foods, salt flavors the growth of desirable bacteria while inhibiting the growth of others. You should not attempt to make sauerkraut or fermented pickles by cutting back on the salt required. Sugar. White sugar is preferred for pickling unless the recipe calls for brown. White sugar produces a lighter colored product. Unless the recipe calls for a sugar substitute, use regular sugar. Heat and/or storage can cause bitterness and loss of flavor. Sugar also helps plump pickles and keep them firm. There are special recipes with reduced sugar or sugar substitutes if you need to reduce sugar in sweet or sweet pickles. And the next one is vinegar. Use vinegar with an acidity of at least 5%, which is typically the level of acidity in most commercially bottled vinegars. Do not use homemade vinegars unless you know they are at least 5% acidity, and do not dilute unless the recipe specifies. This dilutes the preservative effect. White vinegar produces better colored pickles, especially for light foods such as onions. But some people like the flavor of apple cider vinegar and think it has a milder taste. And now for our seasonings. We want to choose fresh, whole spices because they create the best quality and flavorful pickles. Powdered spices may darken the product and make the liquid cloudy. Use a clean white cloth or cheesecloth bag to tie whole spices together loosely. Remove the bag from the product before packing in jars. This will produce a lighter color pickled product. And water. With pickling and especially with fermented pickles, avoid heavily chlorinated water, which can kill microorganisms and could inhibit fermentation. If you can smell or taste chlorine in your water, use a filter. Boil it to evaporate the chlorine or use water from another source. Sometimes water with high levels of minerals can produce dark or discolored pickles. Soft water is a better choice. Better quality pickles. Most people prefer a plump and firm pickle. There are some things you can do for a better quality pickle. First, be sure you start with the right cucumber. Start with a fresh pickling cucumber that is not overly mature. Remove and discard 1/16 of a slice from the blossom end of the fresh cucumber. Blossoms may contain an enzyme which causes excessive softening of pickles. You don't need to use a grape leaf, which inhibits the enzyme if you slice the bottom end off. Covering the cucumbers with cubed or crushed ice 4 to 5 hours before pickling can help to make them crisper. This is a safer method than using firming agents. In addition to removing 1/16 inch from the blossom end of the end using ice, firming agents are available. These include potassium, aluminum sulfate, lime, and calcium granules. If you use good quality ingredients and up-to-date methods, firming agents are not needed for crisp pickles. Alum is a food preservative sometimes used for pickling and canning to help create crisp pickled fruits or vegetables. It may be safely used if fermented pickles or too firm fermented pickles. However, it is unnecessary and is not included in many USDA tested recipes. Alum does not improve the firmness of quick process pickles. Calcium. The calcium in lime can improve pickle firmness. Just be sure you choose food grade lime, available where canning supplies are sold, instead of agricultural lime. Food grade lime may be used in a lime water solution for soaking fresh cucumbers 12 to 24 hours before pickling them. Pickle crisp granules, which have calcium, are available commercially and are also an option. Add granules to filled jars just before applying lids. Now, how to remove the excess lime. When using lime, it is important to remove excess lime absorbed by the cucumbers to make safe pickles. To remove excess lime, drain the lime water solution, rinse, and then re-soak the cucumbers in fresh water for about 1 hour. Repeat the rinsing and soaking steps 2 more times. There is a treatment called low temperature pasteurization. It results in a better product texture, but must be carefully managed to avoid possible spoilage. Place jars in a canner filled halfway with warm water, which is between 120 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Then add hot water to a level 1 inch above jars. Heat the water enough to maintain 180 degrees to 185 degrees Fahrenheit water temperature for 30 minutes. Check with a candy or jelly thermometer to be certain that the water temperature is at least 180 degrees Fahrenheit during the entire 30 minutes. Temperatures higher than 185 degrees Fahrenheit may cause unnecessary softening of pickles. And be cautious when doing this. Use only when recipe indicates. So now we're going to go into a step-by-step process on how to pickle. So we want to prepare our water bath canner and fill your canner and begin heating water before you do anything else. Bring water to a simmer before adding the jars of pickled product. This is about 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Wash jars and lids with rings and soap and water. Sterilize the jars in a large pot of boiling water for 10 minutes. If you do not plan to process the jam for 10 minutes, in case you are processing for 5 minutes. So you want to make sure you read your manufacturer's labels for your lids, and you want to sterilize your jars for 10 minutes. All right, so we're going to look at the type of canning jars that you should use. To process pickles in a boiling water bath, you'll need to start You will need standard canning jars and 2-piece lids. Jars with wire bales are not designed for canning because when processed, they will not seal correctly, which leads to spoilage. They should be used for pickled and fermented foods stored in the refrigerator. You want to prepare your cucumbers. First, you want to wash them. Make sure that you are using clean water, and using a vegetable brush to clean them well. You want to cut 1/16 of an inch off of the blossom end. Cut into 3/16 inch slices. Combine cucumbers and onions in a large bowl. Add the salt. Cover with 2-inch crushed or cubed ice, and refrigerate 3 to 4 hours. Then next, you're going to combine your vinegar, sugar, mustard seed, celery seed, and ground turmeric. You're going to boil this for 10 minutes. Drain cucumbers and your onions. Add cucumbers and onions to vinegar solution. Reheat to boiling. Next, you will fill your jars. You want to fill your jars with your cucumbers, onions, and pickling solution. Leave a 1/2 inch headspace. Remove your air. Add more cucumbers or solution as needed. Wipe the rims with a damp, clean towel to remove any particle of food. Apply the lids and adjust with fingertips. And to process your pickles, you want to load jars into your canner using that jar lifter. Add more boiling water if needed. Turn heat to the highest position, cover the canner with a lid, and heat until the water boils vigorously. Keep the canner covered for the process time. You can lower the heat if the canner continues to boil gently and steadily for the entire processing time. If water stops boiling at any time, restart the time process. Using a jar lifter, remove the jars one at a time. Carefully place the hot jars right side up directly onto dry towels or a cake cooling rack to prevent jars from breaking when they come in contact with a cold surface. Tennessee is blessed with hills and mountains. Many counties, especially in eastern Tennessee, may have areas where elevations exceed 1,000 feet. When you boil water at a higher altitude, it boils at a lower temperature. Therefore, it is important for safety that you add additional processing time. For example, if you process your pickles at altitudes from 1,000 to 6,000 feet, you will need to add additional minutes to the processing time. And most areas in Middle Tennessee, we fall somewhere in between the 1,000 to 6,000. There's a couple of counties that are under, but so that would be important for you to add at least 5 minutes to your processing time. And then now for storing pickles, you want to leave your cans, your pickles sitting out on that towel or cooling rack for at least 12 to 24 hours. So do not move them. You want to leave them sitting there. That way they're going to cool completely. You want to make sure that they are sealed. You can do that by pressing down on the lid. You want to remove the rings, label them, and store in a cool, clean, dry place. And for labeling, you want to put what it is, when it was made, and also you could put a batch number. That way if you're making more. And the last thing for you to do is enjoy your pickles. And I am going to show you all the Bedford County website. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, now, Whitney Danhoff, she has created this website for us to store all of these resources for our Extension Explorers program. So you can find this at bedford.tennessee.edu, and you're going to come to the family programs, and here you will see Extension Explorers, food preservation. And she has all of our dates, topics listed here. And then, as you can see, we've got all of our topics. And so if we click on pickled fruits and vegetables, then you're going to find all of these tested recipes. So they're safe to use. We have some videos. We also have some reduced sugar, sodium recipes. And then we have some resources. And again, all of these are tested recipes. So if we clicked on, there's the gherkins we were looking at, we talked about just a minute ago. So you can see that this recipe came from the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And then she also has some frequently asked questions. So if you had a question, then you could probably find the answer here. And this is a very good resource. So anytime you have any questions or you just want to find one of those recipes, you can look at it and also see the other resources from the past ones. All right, Lauren. Are we ready to